Last year in America, 2,237 fewer people were fatally shot than in 2024. That's according to the Gun Violence Archive. That works out to six fewer people killed, six lives saved on an average day. More than 5,500 fewer were injured in non-fatal shootings. Not only that, community gun violence fell in 2025 after falling dramatically in 2024 and after falling in 2023 and in 2022. From coast to coast, the 4 years of significant decreases have driven homicides not just to pre-pandemic levels, but to historic lows in cities such as San Francisco, Oakland, Chicago, Detroit, Baltimore, Philly. Any life cut short by gun violence is, of course, one too many. It's not time for anyone to declare mission accomplished. And yet, the sharp decline in firearm homicides and non-fatal shootings, it's good news, right? It's a big deal. And if you care about the safety of our homes, our neighborhoods, our country, it should also be a catalyst for rigorous inquiry. Simply put, we need to better understand why these forms of gun violence are falling so much in order to be better equipped to drive them down even further. That is the conversation we are here to have today. I'm James Burnett, Managing Director of The Trace, and it's my honor to welcome you to our first virtual event of 2026. Thank you all for being here. Our independent newsroom has a singular mission for those of you who may be new to it. We're the only media organization dedicated to reporting on gun violence. Our journalists investigate what drives the issue and who profits from it. We gather the data to help you see gun violence more clearly and collaborate with a network of more than 315 media partners to empower more than 20 million people a year with the hard facts of a problem too often politicized. We also devote considerable attention to examining solutions. As an independent nonprofit organization, we're able to put together gatherings like this because of our generous donors and funders. So a special thanks to the supporters joining us today. One more thing before we get started. On the bottom of your screens down there, in the little Zoom nav bar, there's a Q&A button. I think we actually have our first question already entered, so that's off to a good start. As the conversation proceeds today, you have a question for one of our speakers, pop it into that Q&A, and at the final 10-15 minutes, we'll get to as many of those as we can. And with all of that, it's time to introduce our moderator. Jen Mascia will be leading our conversation today. She is a senior news writer and a founding staff member of The Trace. Now, I have not fact-checked this, but I'm confident that no other journalist has been covering gun violence at the national level for longer than Jen. Her deep knowledge of the beat makes her ideally suited to facilitate today's discussion. Now, on to our panelists. Reygan Cunningham is the director of the Crime and Justice Policy Lab West, an organization that, in my view, is developing one of the most enlightening frameworks for understanding why some cities do better at sustaining gun violence reductions than others. I hope she'll share some of those insights with us today. Her wisdom on community gun violence prevention is born from frontline experience. Earlier in her career, Reygan was the director of Oakland's ceasefire structure during a period when that city saw significant and sustained reductions in shootings. Jeff Asher is a crime statistician who closely tracks the rise and fall of murders and violent crime in America, puts that data in context, and examines why public perceptions of crime trends often don't match reality, another topic we may touch on today. He's the co-founder of Datalytics, the creator of the Real-Time Crime Index, the author of the must-read Jeffalytics Substack, and the host of a fascinating podcast by the same name. Jocelyn Fontaine's leadership in community violence prevention has spanned philanthropy, policy, government, and research. We're so thrilled that she's here to lend her broad expertise to this conversation. She's the inaugural executive director of the Black and Brown Collective for Community Solutions to Gun Violence, as well as vice president for strategic program development at the Urban Institute. The former vice president for criminal justice research at Arnold Ventures and has been an adjunct professor at Georgetown and American University. Nick Wilson is a senior director for gun violence prevention at the progressive think tank, the Center for American Progress, where he recently co-authored a new blueprint for community safety and crime prevention that I think challenges the old political dynamics of those issues in important ways. Before that, Nick was Associate Director of Policy Planning and Coordination at the Baltimore City Mayor's Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement. Again, frontline experience there. And he's also served Executive Director of the States United to Prevent Gun Violence and the Maine Gun Safety Coalition. Last but not least, from the Trace is joining us is Chip Brownlee, a staff writer who covers federal policy, Second Amendment jurisprudence, community violence intervention, gun violence solutions. Most importantly, or most relevant to this conversation, he's the author of our Trajectory newsletter, the only newsletter of its kind dedicated to spotlighting the people, policies, and programs grappling with gun violence in America. Jen, over to you. And a reminder, audience, please pop those questions into the Q&A button.
Thanks, James. Pleasure to have the panelists today. We're so lucky to have their expertise. So for the last few years, as James mentioned, the big story on our beat has been that gun violence is falling. According to the CDC, gun deaths peaked at 48,830 in 2021, the highest on record, but they'd fallen to 44,492 in 2024, a decline that's driven entirely by drops in homicide. The Council on Criminal Justice reported last month that homicides in 2025 could be the lowest rate recorded since 1900. So first, I want to start by talking about why gun violence has dropped so much. So many different factions have taken credit for this. Democratic lawmakers say it's the Biden administration policies, along with the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. Republicans say it's the Trump administration policies, including his federal occupation of cities. Attorney General Pam Bondi just claimed credit for this last week at her House hearing. Gun reform advocates and local officials say it's due to targeted community violence intervention, or CVI. You're going to hear that a lot in this discussion, buoyed by an unprecedented outlay of federal cash during the Biden administration. And criminologists say we're just coming down from a post-pandemic peak when crime soared amid a major social upheaval and unprecedented gun buying. So I'd love to get each of your takes on this. And Jeff, let's start with you.
All right. One, I think the answer is we don't know. And my personal opinion is that, like, the more confidence that a person answers this why question with, the more I tend to sort of discount the veracity of the statement. So now I'm going to very confidently answer the question of why. I think that there are two factors that really stand out for me as explanatory. And when you think about this question, you really have to answer the totality of it, which is, one, we've seen an unprecedented drop, especially in gun deaths due to homicide. It's happened everywhere. Oakland had the lowest murders since the 1960s last year. San Francisco had the fewest murders since 1942. New York had the fewest shootings they've ever recorded. Chicago had the fewest murders since the 1960s. So it's everywhere. And so you have to describe why it's not, hey, we implemented X program, or, this law enforcement strategy that we tried seems to be promising. The other thing that you have to note is that it started in 2023 really to pick up steam. And we saw record drop in murder in 2023, 2024, and then again in 2025. So the roots of it are probably stuff that happened in the 2021, 2022 timeframe. You have to explain the fact that the country is still awash in guns. We've seen a drop in the number of gun sales since sort of that post-COVID peak, but we still see a very high level of gun sales based on the FBI's background check data. We didn't solve the roots of crime. So you talk about, hey, we need to fix education and poverty, and those are all very worthwhile goals, but we didn't solve any of those. And so that doesn't really explain it. And so the thing that stand out to me are, one, that you mentioned that investment of federal dollars. We spent a ton of money, like an incomprehensibly large amount of money, on things that both have obvious connections to crime reduction. DOJ spent $1 billion more in grants through OJP on things like community violence programs and the like in 2023 and 2024 compared to what it was spending in 2021 and 2022. There was also an enormous investment in infrastructure. And so things like neighborhood and social centers saw something like a 90% increase in state and local government spending on these things, enormous increase in street and highway and lighting. And so these are things that we know are not directly tied to violence reduction, but if you improve street lighting, you tend to reduce crime. If people are together, it tends to reduce crime. So I think that we threw a lot of money at the wall, and some of it undoubtedly helped reduce crime, makes sense. And then the other thing is that you look at the trend in murders, that huge rise in 2020, sort of peaking 2021, 2022, and then falling sharply 2023 to present. You compare that to things that are sort of, you would think, unassociated with that, like drug overdose deaths, alcohol-related deaths, traffic accident deaths. We've even seen a smaller but significant drop in suicides. And so we see all of these things happening at the same time, and it suggests it's sort of, I guess, corny or simplistic, but society is healing. That thing that broke in COVID in 2020 and 2021, I was home with 4 kids under 4. Like, part of me broke, and it's just, you're healing after that. Societally, that is what's happening. And I look at something like carjackings, which absolutely skyrocketed in 2020 and 2021, probably like no other crime other than gun violence, maybe even more so than gun violence. And those are falling at an obscenely fast level, like a 50%, 60% drop over the last 3 years, which I take to be totally unrelated. And people are just, the kids that tend to commit carjacking, which tends to be more of a juvenile crime, are just doing it less. And the drivers are just not there. And so those are kind of the explanations that stand out to me.
I completely agree with what Jeff said. No surprise. We've at Center for American Progress, we've been really tracking the rise and then the falls. And, I think we have a better idea of the theories of maybe why it rose. And, some of the things that Jeff mentioned, there was a real disruption to social services and people's routine activities. People were isolated, doing more alcohol and drug use, shock to kind of our whole economic and social systems. And so as we kind of, local government services recovered, domestic violence, nonprofits were able to reach more people. We were able to expand healthcare and substance use treatment. We saw things going better. And so that's why I think we're seeing kind of a national, in almost every community, a decline. And a lot of this was made possible through American Rescue Plan Act and Bipartisan Safer Community Act. Again, some of it crime prevention, but also after school programs and summer programs and this community infrastructure. But recently a CAP to try to understand maybe what are some of the reasons why it's been going even lower in some of the cities that Jeff mentioned, is that we've really been looking at what are the cities that are overperforming. Let's say that there was maybe, a 30 to 40% decline everywhere. We saw that 17 of the 50 largest cities, comparing 2021 to 2025, saw a decline in gun victimization over 50%. And 14 out of these 17 cities have lower gun victimization rates in 2015 than even 2019, before this national surge. And again, we can't, it's too early to tell, and we may never know exactly which policies, but we're looking at what the cities are crediting with the reductions, and we're seeing a lot of commonalities. So we're seeing some cities that really invested in community violence intervention and community-based responses and alternative responders, so police can focus on what they need to. We've seen really effective focus deterrent strategies that combine data-driven policing strategies with coordination with community groups. We've seen a lot more investment in crime gun intelligence and NIBINs and improving clearance rates and advanced investigative tools. And we've also seen a lot more coordination. We've seen more office of violence prevention, or more, let's focus on a small number of people and places driving violence and do a coordinated response. And so these are the things that cities themselves that are overperforming are crediting, and we're keeping an eye on these trends.
I just want to add a few things to that, and I totally agree with Nick and Jeff. I agree with that, and I would also say that the work that we do at our organization, we often work in what I consider like the outlier cities. So there is a mention that the homicide rate started going down in 2023. For Oakland, that was not the case. Our homicide rates continued to be very high during that time. The other city that my colleagues work in is Baltimore. Baltimore's numbers during the pandemic were already so high, they didn't get any higher. It was just that bad. So I do think for some cities that I kind of consider kind of the outlier cities, this is to Nick's point, there were some intentional actions that were taken in those cities specifically that I think helped to contribute to the the reductions that I think are worthwhile for discussion because one of the things I'll speak specifically with Oakland, historically when the numbers were down nationally for Oakland, I mean for the nation and even the state of California, that was just not the case for Oakland. So there are some cities where we kind of buck trends. And I would say that in these past couple of years, we kind of look at it through what we call the key capacity framework. And there's like these key elements that from that key capacity framework that I'll talk about a little bit later that were present in those cities, that were these kind of outlier cities that I think have also helped contribute to the reductions.
I'll jump in here and appreciate and agree with the comments that my panelists have made, and actually really appreciate Jeff's point about the country is healing. And so I sort of want to, with the same sort of spirit that, like Jeff said, anyone who says that they know what is contributing to this and saying that with a lot of confidence is overstating this. I do, with that said and with that caveat, really want to underscore what I've seen as really contributing to the reductions, again, not in a causal framework, but is the significant infusion of resources and community investment. And in particular in community-led violence reduction strategies, that infusion of resources, attention, dollars has been significant, and I think is part of the overall story here. And different cities and states use that money differently, and some of it also went to law enforcement. But I think that that's a part of the story here. And I want to lift up, some of the work that Chicago, for example, has done, which is demonstrating how an approach that is building on private and public resources, so folks that are coming together to align their resources to really focus on the neighborhoods that are at the highest risk of violence, where violence is concentrated, and really supporting the community groups, the community-based groups that have been doing work in those neighborhoods for decades, but with fewer resources, fewer attention, and really focusing on how to scale and make a dent on the violence problem in those places is really innovative and novel. And doing that in a way that's also in partnership with local researchers that have gotten much, much better, university partners in being able to support community violence interventions by saying, here's what we know about patterns of violence and where interventions should be targeted. And the last thing that I'll say about Chicago, again, just putting it part of this overall story of places that have seen significant reductions, is this real discipline for trying to test and understand and do more research to contribute to the understanding of what is working. So just wanted to lift that up in addition to the other comments that have been made about where we're seeing some really significant reductions that are part of this overall story of understanding what's working.
Yeah, I agree with everyone, and y'all didn't leave me much to add, but I will say a couple more things, which is there's also been a real expansion of states changing their kind of legal frameworks around guns. We've seen a bunch of states pass expanded background checks since 2020, several states expanding waiting periods. It's been mentioned already, I think, but we're now up to 15 states that have offices of violence prevention, and those offices are adding to the big influx of federal funding. They're also adding state funding to CVI and gun violence research. And then on the federal level, which I think might could help explain the decrease nationwide, in addition to all of the federal funding, there was also a significant ATF crackdown on law-breaking gun dealers that happened during this time frame, enhanced background checks for young people that came out of the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. So I think, let's be honest, we still don't really know why crime declined so significantly in the 1990s. So we're probably not going to know exactly why it declined now. And it's probably going to be a combination of things. But I will say that I think you could argue that it's just a reversion to the mean. But I think the fact that we're now in so many places at a level of gun violence, at least, that is lower than before the pandemic, that suggests to me that it's not just a reversion to the mean. And so that those are my thoughts. And one last thing, which is on the gun sales and the availability of guns. We know that the more guns there are in a place, the higher the rate of firearm death, and that's just something that we know confidently from the research. And yes, gun sales are still high, but they're down more than 30% from the peak during COVID. And we also know that crime guns tend to be younger guns. They tend to be guns that were sold more recently. So that decline in gun sales could also be contributing to this as well.
Those were all great insights. The question now becomes, how can we sustain these gains, especially given the political environment with a dim view of cities and their governments coming from the very top and a loss of the very federal funding that may have contributed to these gains, at least for the next 3 years? How can we avoid another upswing in violence? And as part of your answer, I was wondering if each of you could share an example of maybe a unique policy that works. Like Jeff just mentioned, something as simple as street lighting or clearing blight, or a policy you'd like to highlight maybe that shows success in keeping violence down, no matter what the funding situation is. Jocelyn, let's start with you.
Okay. So I want to, something that Chip said just also reminded me of a point that I wanted to make, which is also that what I've seen, or seen across the country, what we've seen is a real professionalization of the work of violence reduction, right? And recognizing that focusing on this issue is, yes, in the domain of police and the criminal justice system, but also needs a broader array of stakeholders and folks focused on this. And so what we've seen with the amount of offices of violence prevention or reduction that are popping up in cities, as well as the professionalization of the frontline CVI workforce, I think is worth attention, right? That there's these offices, there's training and technical assistance providers that are focusing on how folks can do their work better. There's national conferences where folks can come together and share lessons and best practices, challenges in this work, and opportunities for getting better. And I think that's not a policy, but it is a way in which this field has evolved just in the time that I've been in it, that I think is worth mention, right? Is that we've gotten better as a field in focusing on this issue, and again, bringing sort of a broader array of stakeholders to focus on violence prevention that are outside of the criminal justice system. So that's how I would answer that question. And I think the idea of again, sort of how do we sustain these gains is, I think that we keep pushing forward, right? And there's actually no other option here, right? I think a lot of us are worried about what is going to happen because the federal cancellations and the sort of them leaving this leadership in this field is a big deal, right? And full stop. And that also is having significant implications in the research field as well, and our understanding and documentation, doing impact evaluation of what is working. But I think that all it does is just demand that more folks from city and states and private folks, private philanthropy, businesses have to lean into this more to continue to maintain the safety gains. And so far, we haven't seen the bottom fall out, and continuing to sort of cross fingers on that. So what this tells us is that we can make sustainable reductions in violence when there's focused attention on this, and doing it the various ways that we just talked about across the virtual room here, these different policies and practices. And I think it's just continuing to push on this and filling in the void that the federal government, which is a big one. I don't mean to suggest that that's an easy thing that we do, but it's continuing to push forward and using all of our partners and the ecosystem here to continue to focus on community safety.
Yeah, I think totally agree with Jocelyn. I think one of the smartest things people in the CVI field did over the last 5 years was really, in addition to funding, kind of smaller programs in cities across the country, they really focused on the infrastructure and setting up the training and technical assistance to make sure that this stuff could survive even without, funding, when some of that stuff is under threat, setting up a structure where they can keep pushing and find other ways to do the work. I think that is really significant. But the biggest thing to me that I'm worried about, but I'm also hopeful about, is keeping focus on this issue is probably the biggest thing. And I'm worried that because we're not in a crisis anymore, that the focus may drift from this. And I think the way that you keep sustaining these decreases is keeping focusing on it. You don't give up on the work, whether the work is CVI, whether the work is trying to improve policing, whether the work is, funding red flag laws, extreme risk protection orders. You can't let off the gas basically now that we're just not in a crisis anymore. And I think that that's how you sustain the decreases.
That's a great point, and why I'm a big fan of the trace, because you continue to have the focus on the policies and the problems that are presented. I have our political environment is very dim right now. We have this ARPA and BISCA fiscal cliff. There's a real need for more federal funding, but we have a Trump administration doesn't care about making our communities safer. And so the states are going to have to continue to step up. We're going to have to continue to pressure governors and state legislators to continue to fund what works. ATF is no longer holding gun dealers accountable. So now we need states to step up and do their own inspections and give them the tools to be able to stop the flow of guns. And in CAP's federal framework, we very specifically call for federal funding for a host of policies, and we're going to continue to push for that. But we know in this governing moment, that's not possible. And so in our framework, we got a lot of attention for calling on Congress to fund 7,000 more detectives to solve more crimes, invest in crime labs, crime gun intelligence centers, and really make sure we get swift and certain justice, which is what the criminology research says. And there's some things that are less flashy in there about we need to invest in our courts and alternative prosecution, and more public defenders and faster case resolution. But one thing that hasn't gotten a lot of attention, to Jennifer's point, is that we also really need to invest in victim services. And this is a place I think we can get a lot of bipartisan support in red and blue states. And someone who is a victim one day may be offender the next time. And we need to use these, when someone is harmed, we need to provide services, whether it's housing or trauma recovery or mental health care, legal services. Because if we can help someone, we can maybe prevent them from retaliating. And, we need to hire more victim service liaisons in law enforcement agencies and do more safety planning. And we can frame this as also trying to solve more cases with, relocation for witnesses and victims so they can testify. And so there's a lot we can do in bipartisan support at the state and local levels.
So I just want to agree with everyone else on the panel. I really appreciate, Chip, what you brought up earlier, is that I'm seeing this at the city level, where because there have been these historic reductions, there is kind of like, kind of we've won, if you will. And so that's why I think it's so important that all the work that folks on this panel do, as well as folks who aren't on this panel, of keeping the pressure on at every level. So there are folks, who work at the state level, continuing to keep the focus on at the state level, at the federal level. It's a very challenging environment right now, but we still have to keep that fight and that focus on reducing gun violence. Because even though we've seen these reductions, like I said, Oakland, for example, that's still more than 50 people who were murdered, who lost their children. So we haven't won this at all. We want to get to zero. We want to get to the point where even the quote unquote outlier cities are seeing the same levels of safety, if not more, than suburban communities, more affluent communities. So that's the end game. But again, it's just being able to keep the pressure on at every level, at the community level, all the way up to the folks who do work at the state and federal level. And I'll also add to Jocelyn's point, there is an opportunity, because we have seen these dramatic reductions. There is an opportunity for philanthropy to continue to play a more pivotal role. The loss of federal funding is huge. It's dramatic. Well, let's not act like this can just be done for free. People need funding. CBOs need funding. Cities need funding to continue to work with folks who are at the very highest risk of violence, and continue to work with them so that they can sustain and lower risk levels. So I do think there is an opportunity now that philanthropy is seeing like, oh, I can play a role in this. These are the specific things that I can do. And I think with some leadership, at again the different levels from the state level down to the local level and the mayors and the city administrator, bringing those philanthropic organizations to the table to do things that are similar to what Chicago is doing, as Jocelyn mentioned earlier, or even doing things similar what's happening in Baltimore and other cities across the nation, of saying like, hey, we had funding for violence interrupters. We don't have that funding anymore because, it was tied to a federal grant. What can we do between philanthropy and the city and CBOs to be able to ensure that we have this key component of our overall strategy? So it is challenging. I share the same concern, Chip, that you mentioned, and it's real. It is very, very real. But I also am encouraged by the opportunities that have been created with these joint partnerships with philanthropy, and also because we've able to see and realize reductions for some cities for the first time in a long time, that being able to want for people to stay in that place of hope, of knowing that not only is this great, but we can do even better.
If I can, I'm sorry, just to build a little bit on what Reygan was saying, is like the other thing that gives me optimism is the people that are doing this work, is that there is a field of folks, especially in the CVI space, who have long been doing it, but with the former administration, received these resources and the attention. And that has created a pretty big movement of people who are not going to let this fall or focus on something else. And so I get a ton of hope from that, is the leaders in places who are continuing to do this work, to do the work of keeping their community safe. And that there's conferences and, again, sort of technical assistance providers who are in place supporting this work, that I am optimistic. And again, not to overstate that we can just fill the hole that the federal government has put before us, but incredibly optimistic for that, and don't think that the attention will be shifted elsewhere, at least not from those groups of people.
I was just going to add that I think to Nick's point, that if you sort of approach the reality of the political situation that we have, the political moment that we're in, and focus on the things that we sort of can potentially build bipartisan support for, then something like clearance rates becomes a major point that sort of everyone can agree is, okay, let's go after, putting shooters and murderers behind bars and solving crime. And so to that end, we have lots of research that shows that the more resources, and surprisingly, the more resources you pour into solving crime, the more crimes you're going to solve. And so things that enable both technologies and just staffing and resource allocation that allows for law enforcement to solve more crimes, I think is one thing that we can do at this moment. Because in a lot of ways, like to your initial question, we can't guarantee that things won't get worse, that it won't get better, or that it won't see a reversal of what we've seen the last few years, because we don't fully understand why we've seen what's happened the last few years. And so we just sort of have to guess and do our best. And so that's one area that I think makes a lot of sense.
As we're talking, it occurs to me that our president is actually a gun violence survivor. And so it's a shame that he isn't more receptive to some of these arguments. Here's hoping, I guess. So violence is not down everywhere, as some of our panelists have noted. I'd like to spend a few minutes on the places where it never goes down, places like Brownsville and Brooklyn, where I live. What keeps violence so high in some communities throughout administrations? This is throughout Democratic, Republican administrations. What is going on there, and what can we focus in these areas? Reygan, let's start with you.
Yeah, I can't speak to the specific community, but like I said, most of the cities that we work in, are largely, cities that are considered outliers, where violence traditionally doesn't go down. They're often very poor cities. They're often cities that have a significant population of African American and Latinos. And so I do think with those cities, and then I'll say specifically for the cities that we've worked in, in my experience in Oakland, like I said, when everybody else's crime rate was going down, ours was going up. It didn't matter what was happening in the state of California. It didn't matter what was happening nationally. Like that was just our story. It didn't matter when the ATF came in, the FBI. I mean, it didn't matter. And I think one of the things that we found in Oakland and now have been able to translate to other cities across the US and then also some cities in Latin America was that, there's a couple of things that I think about that really matter in terms of reducing gun violence. And again, we have done some research on this. We're going to continue to do research at UPenn on this, but we call it like the key capacities framework. So there have been these models that have existed for a long time. And, some are great, some need a little bit more work, but there's these models. Most of these cities have tried some version of these models and they don't work. Oakland tried ceasefire or gun violence reduction focused deterrence for years and it didn't work, and it eventually did. But again, we had to do or implement what we know now, or we call the key capacities, which includes, a political leader, political governance, political champion. So you need a mayor, city administrator that's going to say, hey, reducing gun violence is my top priority. And not only am I just going to say that, but I'm actually going to hold people accountable for doing that. So that's one of the things. The other thing is understanding who is at very highest risk of gun violence into your community. Most of the cities that we work in don't really have the best idea about who is at very highest risk of gun violence now. And most of their ideas around that is driven by the media. So a lot of times people will say, oh, it's a youth issue, it's our juveniles. And in almost every city we've worked in the US, as well as in Latin America, it's typically not juveniles. And so understanding who is at the very highest risk of gun violence now and being able to develop a service infrastructure that's appropriate for that demographic. So understanding who's at very highest risk. The other thing is what we call kind of cross-sector collaboration. There's not just one CBO that can just do this for a whole entire city or even just government, for example. So being able to have a citywide strategy that includes community-based organizations, as well as efforts from the city to help reduce gun violence. The other things that we talk about is operational management. And what that really means is like, okay, we could all be doing these great things in isolation, but who is going to like convene and manage all these aspects of this citywide strategy, right? Who's going to be in charge of that? And who's going to be the convener to bring folks together so that we can use performance indicators to see whether whether our efforts are working or not. So again, having a key operational management team. And then a robust violence reduction infrastructure. So again, I go back to that, understanding who's at very highest risk. Once you understand that, you have to have some type of infrastructure to support the folks who are at highest risk. And so that's going to often be found in CBOs. And as Jocelyn mentioned, a lot of cities have now departments of violence prevention, but having a robust infrastructure to be able to support folks. And so again, that kind of goes back to the funding that a lot of people received during the pandemic. The funding did go towards building a violence, a CVI infrastructure, if you will. But that also includes having a law enforcement at the city level who, number one, their goal was to reduce gun violence because that's not always the case. And I would say the other thing is also operates in a legitimate way in their communities, right? Because if folks in the community are seeing their efforts, their reductions to reduce gun violence as illegitimate, it's not going to be effective. And last is sustainability. You got to get some evaluations. Evaluations cost money. The other thing is you need to think about a co-governance model. Mayors turn over in most cities every 4 to 8 years. And so how do you, even if this mayor has convened this great group of people, done all these wonderful things, chances are they're going to move on in 4 to 8 years. So how do you continue to do that? And so one of the things that we have looked at is what does a co-governance model look like with community partners so that the people who live there are always going to continue to be there and to hold this work together. So I think when we talk about cities that haven't reduce gun violence and seem to always be challenged by that. Like I said, two of the cities that we work with now were those cities. Baltimore was the city where like I said, it was so bad during the pandemic, the numbers didn't get any worse because they were already that bad. But I think what has happened under the leadership of Mayor Scott, again, got really good technical assistance, et cetera. But under his leadership, he has been able to say, hey, no, we can turn this around and let's do these very intentional key things to ensure that our city is safe. And same thing in Oakland. We've had a lot of challenges. We were an outlier city, but I think doing these things that I mentioned as key capacities have helped. And so again, for these cities that really struggle and seem to be those outliers, even with outlier cities, these key capacities do seem to turn the page for them. And again, more study needs to be done. It's not a complete answer, but I do think it has been helpful in some of our most challenged cities in the US.
And I'll just add something that we don't talk about enough is that uh, gun homicides is a real pressing problem in rural America as well. We focus a lot on the cities as we should. But honest, Chandler Hall at CAP, my colleague, he looked at the 50 US counties with the highest rates of firearm homicides between 2021 and 2024. And half of those US counties with the highest rates of gun homicides are rural in places like Mississippi and Arkansas and Alabama that they don't have hospital-based violence intervention programs or comprehensive violence prevention agencies or trauma centers. They might have longer drive times, emergency services, and they have smaller police agencies with less technology to investigate. And so we talk a lot about the success stories of cities, but I think we also need to talk about how we can reduce gun violence in our rural communities as well.
I just want to add one other thing, which is I think we should definitely remember that there are disparities between neighborhoods for sure. And Brownsville is a great example. New York City has one of the lowest gun violence rates of any major city in the country, but Brownsville still has, one of the highest rates within the city. But I think we should also remember too that it's not Brownsville is not down to the level of the rest of the city, but it's down significantly. Like in 1993, there were 74 murders in the 73rd precinct where Brownsville is, and last year in 2025 there were 7, and that is a significant decrease over that time frame. And I've done a lot of reporting in Brownsville, and I think part of it there's a lot of underinvestment in the community. And despite having, CVI programs that are doing work there and trying to turn that around, those programs by themselves cannot change those structural problems. So as long as we have structural disinvestment in communities, you're going to have disparities that are not equalized.
One final question that actually dovetails with one of the Q&A questions that we've gotten, and it's how is Trump's federal occupation of several key cities affecting gun violence? How is this ICE enforcement affecting gun violence? The current administration argues that it's driving crime down because you have more cops on the street, so to speak. But we've reported how it's complicated street level efforts in Minneapolis and Philadelphia. One of the key ways is that people are afraid to trust police now. Clearance rates, depend on, and solving crime depends on people coming forward to law enforcement, being witnesses. And we've reported how that's been complicated by this ICE enforcement. So what are our panelists? What are you hearing on the ground? How are police and CVI leaders dealing with this? And, to the administration's argument, is it bringing crime down?
From a data perspective, I would say almost exclusively no. And you kind of have to separate the types of engagements. You see what you've had in DC and in Memphis, where it wasn't really an immigration effort. It was an effort aimed at getting several hundred federal law enforcement officers onto the streets. And so in DC, you've seen since 2023 a massive drop in crime from the middle of 2023 through the summer of 2025. That just continued at the same level, maybe a couple of weeks of lower gun violence. But again, it's hard to tease out when you've had 2 straight years of large declines in gun violence. what sort of a couple of weeks factors into that. Memphis, again, they had several hundred federal law enforcement officers were deployed there, not an immigration effort, but specifically a law enforcement crime type effort. Maybe saw a bit of a decline in terms of Memphis, but also another city that was having a large drop in violent crime. Other places where you've seen more of an immigration enforcement effort, like Chicago and Minneapolis, New Orleans, no real change in the before and after pictures. In all of these places, there was already a large drop in crime, and that large drop in crime continued. So I'll let others answer from the sort of community and policy intervention side of things, but certainly from a pure data perspective, I don't see much of a change.
I would just say that for a minute there in January in Minneapolis, like half of the shootings in the city have been related to ICE enforcement operations. So I don't think you can make an argument that the ICE enforcement has helped with gun violence. And when it comes to crime more broadly, I mean, we know that undocumented immigrants have commit some of the lowest rates of violent crime. So I don't see how that is helping. And as Jeff said, it's not showing up in the data. I think when you look at places like Jeff mentioned, Memphis and DC, those two cities, and Jeff, you might can correct me if I'm wrong about this, they started having their declines in violence a little bit later. So a lot of cities started having significant declines in 2022. Places like DC and Memphis didn't start until later in 2023 for some reason. Why that is, I don't really know. But when you look at other cities that had followed that same kind of trajectory, Birmingham, Alabama is another place where this happened. The decreases that are happening now in Memphis and DC are not really outpacing other places like Birmingham, St. Louis that were kind of on that same trend. So I just don't think the data shows that it's helping, that either the National Guard or the ICE enforcement is what's causing declines in violence.
And just to the question of like how this is complicating violence reduction efforts, my organization, we actually hosted a webinar about this a couple of months ago, talking about the experiences of CBI folks in Chicago who are needing to navigate this reality with additional ICE and law enforcement presence. And yes, what that's doing to people's just being fearful of going to law enforcement, folks who are citizens, right? So it's like undermining our efforts to support violence reduction. And, to the extent that CBI frontline workers are navigating, supporting individuals in these places beyond just like the immediate mediation of violence, and that they're supporting them with supporting families and individuals with a whole host of things that are related to to violence, this just complicates all of that, and sort of a new reality that they're needing to navigate and modify their programs accordingly. But it is, contributing to this withdrawal from daily life. Again, even for people who are documented, who are citizens, because fearful of law enforcement and what might happen, and of course what it does to the fabric of a community, that you've got people who are being taken away, and again, how this is just reducing how people are living their lives is not helpful.
Yeah, I mean, I just second everything that folks have already said. I mean, we see this on the ground. I mean, both when I'm in the law enforcement meetings, where investigators are talking about their challenges with people coming forward, and wanting to, even, report crimes. And so having to kind of lean on technology. And that's not, I mean, that has its own bag of worms with that. And then even with regard to like the departments of violence prevention, the CBOs, our community-based organizations that we work with, the same thing, because to Jocelyn's point, it's, it just creates like a withdrawal from life in general, right? So even where CBOs historically have been able to develop those relationships, be able to lean in with the individuals who are at very highest risk, as well as their families, to provide whatever type of support, whether it's housing or other things, there has just been this withdrawal where it's very difficult to have clients even come into the office, not even wanting to some cases like answer their phone because there's like, well, I don't know, somebody listening to the phone. I don't feel safe going to the office. Can you come to me? I'm concerned. I mean, it creates this whole feeling of just feeling unsafe in your own community, in your own home. And so it's just played out in a lot of different ways in all the cities that I've worked in. Like I said, whether it's law enforcement who are trying to solve homicide cases, or whether it's our departments of violence prevention and community-based organizations that are actually trying to support families, but families and individuals just do not feel safe. Even though, the services that are provided may be life-saving, people just don't trust it. So it has made a already very difficult and complicated situation, especially when working with folks who are highest risk, because that's hard enough as it is, but it's made it even more complicated and more difficult.
And I have one other quick thing, which is there's also been a diversion of resources and focus, right? With the immigration enforcement effort, the Trump administration has diverted ATF agents from their normal work of regulating and policing the firearms industry into immigration enforcement. And when it comes to violence intervention programs, the biggest source of funding for that was the Community Violence Intervention and Prevention Initiative at the Department of Justice. And the last call for applications that they put out completely changed the qualification criteria for those programs and are now essentially requiring community-based programs to where they're even eligible to apply. In a lot of places, it can only be cities and local governments. But where they're even eligible to cooperate with immigration enforcement efforts or to, prioritize law enforcement aspects of that. So I think there's also just been this shift that I think it's going to take some time to see how this actually plays out because there's often a delayed, like in the data, there's a delayed reaction to whatever your intervention is. It can take time to see how it plays out.
Jeb, I'm so glad you brought that up because going back to your first question, Jennifer, the not having this federal funding available. The challenge is that now, okay, so that means it's more difficult for states. States are strapped too because the money they were getting from the feds, they're not getting from the feds anymore. And then it's playing out on the local level too, to Chip's point, when there have been solicitations for grants, but it requires cooperation with ICE. So again, it's just traditionally cities, CBOs could rely on, some funding from the federal government, but now that there's this extra layer of cooperation with ICE, again, it makes it even more difficult just from the funding landscape, because most cities who have significant gun violence challenges don't want to be in the position of having to cooperate with ICE when they really just want to focus on what's driving gun violence in their communities.
We have time for one more question from the Q&A, actually. It's two related questions. So say we're in normal times when there's no federal presence on our streets. Is there data that shows a correlation between increased police presence, like beat cops, or increased law enforcement budgets, like funding the police, to a reduction in violent crime? Have police helped in that way? And what about funds or support for community policing? Has that had any impact? Feel free to jump in, any of our panelists.
I'll just say that the data says that most large and medium-sized police departments have shrunk considerably in the last 5 or 6 years. And so that's one of the sort of the main factors that we have to reckon with when trying to describe why all of this is happening, is it's happening with way fewer officers than we had before. There is research that shows that adding police officers does reduce homicide and reduce violent crime, along with a host of other, potentially unwanted factors. If you bring on more officers, they're going to have more arrests. They're going to have more low-level arrests and things like that. So, sort of separating the research from the actual situation we find ourselves in, which is that agencies have lost officers and agencies are having a very difficult time growing. So all of this is happening without something like you saw in the 90s where, hey, every police department added a couple hundred officers in the course of 2 or 3 years. And, maybe you could point to that as a driver in the 90s. We're certainly not seeing that here.
I think politically we get caught up on these questions of, do we need to add 100,000 new cops? Do we need to have less cops? And for me, the question is, well, what are these police officers going to be doing? If they're just going to be driving around or sitting in their cars, no, that's probably not going to make a difference. But if there is a shortage in a city for being able to be part of, a focus deterrent strategy or better deployment or better ways to solve crimes, and engage the community, then yes, there could be an advantage. And so I think a lot of it is, how do we take the existing resources? Because again, it's hard to find a lot of people that want to be police officers right now. How do you take the existing resources and deploy them more effectively? And then bring in, you don't need a person with a badge and a gun doing traffic accident reports or responding to mental health crises, or doing even some traffic stops. How do we have police focus on things that no one else can do, and then bring in professional staff and community responders that are better trained? And I think that's the conversation that we're having now.
One question slash comment that I got that I'd like to share with you because it is important. This participant says, I'm struck that we're not naming race as central to this conversation. Any honest discussion about public safety must acknowledge the racial dynamics shaping funding decisions. When communities of color demonstrate success, the standards often seem to shift. BIPOC communities exercised agency to address violence where public systems fell short. Given this, what should philanthropic and other non-governmental funders prioritize to protect and sustain these gains?
Very much appreciate the question and pushing us to make that explicit, because that's absolutely at the heart of this. And we know for far too long the disparate rates of gun violence and harm and trauma falling on the shoulders of Black and Brown communities. And even though there's been these gains in the last 3 years, that there's still too much death and injury that's happening, particularly with Black boys and young men, Black and Brown boys and young men. And so I would say my response to that is that we just need to continue to invest in people and communities that are close to this harm. It does also matter what they do. I was going to sort of pull on the thread that Nick was talking about with it matters what police do. It matters what these CBOs are doing as well. It matters that they're focusing on the individuals who are most at risk of harm and injury. But I think that it's that simple, even though I know it's very hard in our political climate. But it's more investment in people and more investment in these neighborhoods. So very much appreciate the question.
I appreciate the question as well, and I agree with Jocelyn. The same thing is that, it is really about understanding that in most of the cities, again, that we work in, the folks who are at the very highest risk are typically African American men, including obviously their families, because they have some risk levels as well, and Latino men and their families. And so I think for philanthropy, there are opportunities, lots of opportunities to engage, but I do think that it's ensuring that your funding is going towards the betterment of those who are at very highest risk in whatever community that is. And that can look different ways for philanthropy. For some folks, that might be like, we're not really trying to do kind of the gun violence thing, but okay, you may not want to do that, but there are opportunities you do community transformation of how do we make this particular section, this block, be safer. Jeff mentioned earlier street lighting. There's after school programs. There's a whole bunch of things that can be done. And then there are philanthropic organizations like the ones we've been so blessed to work with who are like, no, let's lean in here and make sure that individuals who are at the very highest risk have real sustained opportunities for a significant period of time. So I think there's various ways that philanthropy can lean in. But you're right. Most of the cities, most of these places where there are very highest rates of gun violence, those who are most often victimized are going to be African American as well as Latino. And that is true. We have to lean into that. And to Nick's point, money is great. We need funding, right? And it's what do you do with that funding? It's for police, it's for CBOs, it's for cities, because I have worked in cities where there's been a lot of funding, but that funding has not gone to communities who have disproportionately been impacted by gun violence. So the funding is important, but it's what do we do with that funding? So my message to philanthropy is always leaning in where and understanding where the communities are most disproportionately impacted. Sending your dollars there and ensuring that there's some accountability around that, I think is critical and key.
Thank you, Reygan and Jocelyn, for bringing us home with your response to that great final question from our audience. We had a ton of engagement, way more questions than we could get to. So apologies to anyone who posed a question we didn't get to. Couple final items. If you visit thetrace.org, you'll see two buttons of note. One is a place where you can subscribe to our newsletter. So if you're not already following the trajectory where Chip touches on many of these issues, or one of our other newsletters, that might be a great place to go just to continue to follow the really important threads raised here. And finally, I do need to ask, if you're so motivated, there's a button where you can donate to support the Trace to keep our work going strong, to allow us to continue to present events like this free of charge to anyone who's interested in learning more about what has driven down gun violence and the topic of today's conversation, how to keep those declines going.